A United States federal marshal has a court order, 6 officers, and the legal authority of the most powerful government on earth behind him. He is standing in the entrance hall of a $47 million estate in Bel Air. On the wall, a Basquiat. In the garage are 2 Porsches and a custom Mercedes. In the cellar, wine that was bottled before most of his officers were born. He takes none of it. He turns around, walks back down the driveway, gets in his car, and drives away empty-handed. Not because the order was defective, not because the evidence was thin, not because anything went wrong, because on paper, in a court of binding law, the man who lives here owns nothing, and the document that made that legally true was drafted in a law office, stamped by a notary, and filed in a jurisdiction most people cannot find on a map. This is not a story about criminals. Criminals hide money. What this story is about is something far more unsettling, a system designed by credentialed attorneys, blessed by sovereign legislatures, and used daily by roughly 80,000 of the wealthiest people on Earth, a system that does not hide assets from the law, but uses the law itself as the hiding place. One island engineered the blueprint, a landmass smaller than Brooklyn, with a parliament you have never heard of, and a set of trust laws so precisely constructed that courts across 3 continents have tried to crack them and walked away with nothing. What follows is how it works, all of it. For most of human history, protecting wealth meant building something physical, a vault, a wall, a moat. The Romans buried gold. Medieval lords built castles. Swiss banks built reputations on discretion and reinforced steel. All of it ultimately could be broken. A good enough army, a good enough drill, a good enough subpoena. Then, in the late 20th century, a small group of lawyers had a different idea. What if the protection was not physical at all? What if it were purely conceptual? A document so precisely engineered that no court, no government, no creditor could find a seam to pull apart. The instrument they perfected was not new. The legal trust dates back to 12th century England, originally designed so that crusading knights could leave their estates in the hands of someone they trusted while they went off to get killed in the Holy Land. The basic structure is almost childishly simple. You transfer ownership of your assets to a trustee who holds them for the benefit of named beneficiaries. The assets are no longer legally yours. They belong to the trust. For 700 years, this was a fairly modest tool. It kept family estates intact. It funded charities. It helped wealthy families skip a generation of inheritance tax. But somewhere in the 1980s, a handful of very creative, very ambitious legal minds asked a question no one had properly asked before. What happens if you design the trust not to serve a charitable purpose or a family legacy, but as a pure weaponized shield against anyone who ever tries to take your money by force? The answer to that question is what built the paper fortress. The Cook Islands sit in the South Pacific, roughly equidistant between New Zealand and Hawaii. 15 islands, a total land area of 240 square kilometers, a population that has never exceeded 20,000 people. In 1981, it had no meaningful financial industry, a subsistence economy heavily dependent on foreign aid, and a government that was quietly desperate for a revenue model that did not involve waiting for fruit to grow. What it had, crucially, was sovereignty. Full, binding, internationally recognized legislative sovereignty, the power to write its own laws, and in 1989 it used that power to pass the International Trusts Act, a piece of legislation so aggressively pro-debtor that it rewrote the practical limits of what a legal structure could accomplish. The key provisions were staggering in their audacity. The statute of limitations on fraudulent transfer claims was cut to 1 year. Foreign court judgments were made categorically unenforceable against Cook Islands trusts. The burden of proof required to penetrate a trust was set so high that almost no plaintiff could realistically meet it, and the local courts, which had final jurisdiction, were under no obligation to recognize the authority of any foreign legal system. It was not an accident It was a deliberate legislative product designed by American asset protection attorneys working in direct consultation with the Cook Islands government. The island would provide sovereignty, the attorneys would provide the clients. Both sides would take a cut. Within a decade, the Cook Islands had become the most legally hostile jurisdiction on Earth for anyone trying to recover money held inside one of its trusts. A tiny island had built the world's most effective financial wall, and it did it entirely with paper. Here is the part that sounds like a paradox, but is completely, rigorously legal. You transfer your $200 million to a Cook Islands trust. You are listed as a beneficiary. You continue to live in your house, drive your cars, and take your vacations. Your lifestyle is completely unchanged. The trustee, following the terms of the trust document, continues to make distributions to you regularly and predictably. You are, to every practical observer, still enjoying every dollar of that money, but you do not own it. You have no legal claim to it. In a court of law under oath, you can state truthfully that you possess no assets of that value, because you do not. The psychology of this is what makes it so durable. Most people cannot emotionally separate enjoyment from ownership. The concept that you can have full use of something without owning it in any legal sense feels intuitively wrong. Surely, a judge thinks, if you benefit from it, you must control it. If you control it, it must be yours. The Cook Islands trust law was explicitly designed to sever that intuition from legal reality. The trust document can be written to give you, as the settler, substantial retained influence, including the ability to change trustees, change beneficiaries, and even move the trust to a different jurisdiction, without those powers constituting legal ownership or legal control. You're steering a ship that, on paper, belongs entirely to someone else. It is not a loophole, it was drafted this way on purpose, and for 30 years it has worked almost every single time it has been tested. If the trust is the fortress, the holding companies are the maze built around it. Virtually no sophisticated offshore structure routes assets directly into a trust. What typically happens is several layers more elegant than that, and several layers more maddening for anyone trying to trace it. The asset, say a commercial real estate portfolio in Miami, is owned by a Delaware LLC. That LLC is owned by a Cayman Islands exempted company. That company is owned by a BVI holding entity. That BVI entity is the asset held inside the Cook Islands Trust. To seize the Miami building, a creditor does not simply file in Florida. They need to pierce the LLC, which requires proving it is a sham entity, which requires obtaining its records, which are in Delaware, which requires a separate legal action, which takes years. Then pierce the Cayman company, which has its own disclosure rules, its own legal system, its own timeline. Then the BVI entity. Then, finally, they arrive at the trust wall, where the Cook Islands law is waiting to inform them that their foreign judgment is unenforceable, and their time limit has likely expired. The average cost of pursuing this sequence of litigation, according to attorneys who've tried it, runs into the millions of dollars before a single asset is touched. Most plaintiffs run out of money first. Some run out of will. A few simply make a calculation. The cost of recovery exceeds the value of recovery and they walk away. This is not a flaw in the system. This is the system. The layers are not concealed. They are friction, legal, expensive, exhausting friction, manufactured in industrial quantities. Every sophisticated Cook Islands trust has one, and almost nobody outside of asset protection law has heard of the role. The protector is a third party, typically an attorney or a trust company, appointed within the trust deed with specific override powers. They are not the trustee. They are not the beneficiary. They exist in a category the law created almost specifically for this purpose. Someone with binding authority over the trust who has no beneficial interest in it whatsoever. Their powers vary by document, but commonly include the ability to remove and replace the trustee, veto distributions, amend the terms of the trust, and in some structures, migrate the entire trust to a different jurisdiction within a matter of days. This last power is the one that makes regulators genuinely uncomfortable. The practical implication is this: if a creditor, a court, or a government agency begins to apply serious legal pressure in the Cook Islands, the protector can, legally, move the entire trust and its assets to a different jurisdiction before that pressure results in any enforceable order. The assets evaporate. The case becomes moot. The plaintiff, having spent years building their legal strategy around one jurisdiction, starts over. This is sometimes called the flee clause in industry documentation. It is written into the trust instrument as a feature, not a contingency. The moment external legal force reaches a certain threshold, the mechanism automatically triggers. The fortress does not just resist attack, it relocates. The theory was elegant, but theories get tested, and in the 1990s and early 2000s, the Cook Islands structure faced a series of challenges that were supposed to prove it was all too clever by half. The most instructive case involved Anderson versus Danning, a Federal Trade Commission enforcement action, in which the FTC obtained a contempt order against a California couple, Denise and Michael Anderson, who had transferred assets into a Cook Islands trust before the FTC's fraud claims were filed. The US court ordered the assets returned. The couple claimed they could not comply because the trust trustee, operating under Cook Islands law, was legally prohibited from repatriating the funds in response to a foreign court order. The US court jailed them for contempt. The assets did not move. The Cook Islands trustee, following the precise letter of the trust document and the Cook Islands statute, declined to act on the US order. The court held the debtors in contempt of an order they genuinely could not enforce, even if they wanted to. The constitutional paradox, being imprisoned for failing to do something legally impossible, became a central argument in asset protection circles for the next 2 decades. Eventually, after extended incarceration produced no assets, the FTC settled for a fraction of the claimed amount. The legal community took precise note. The structure had not just survived a direct attack from a federal agency. It had survived contempt proceedings, incarceration, and years of litigation, and it had not broken. The Cook Islands laws had held. The paper fortress was real. Here is what offshore wealth protection does not look like. It does not look like a man in a linen suit stepping off a yacht in Monaco with a briefcase. It does not look like cash buried in a Cayman wall safe. It does not look like anything from any film you've ever seen about hidden money. What it actually looks like is a folder, a very thick, very precisely drafted folder of trust deeds, corporate resolutions, nominee agreements, and distribution letters. It looks like a registered agent's address in a building in Avarua, the capital of the Cook Islands, where the official correspondence of several thousand trusts is received, logged, and filed. The entire aesthetic of illicit offshore finance, the secrecy, the drama, the suitcases, exists because Hollywood needed a visual metaphor for something that is genuinely, defiantly invisible. The real mechanism is boring on purpose. The more boring it is, the more defensible it is. Colourful transactions attract attention. A distribution letter from a trustee to a beneficiary, processed through a standard bank account, looks like nothing at all. As of 2024, the Financial Secrecy Index produced by the Tax Justice Network ranked the United States itself as one of the world's top financial secrecy jurisdictions, partly because of Delaware and South Dakota's domestic trust structures. The most sophisticated wealth protection in the world is not in a palm tree jurisdiction. It is in a law office in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, run by someone who wears a sensible sweater and drives a Subaru. That is the boring reality. It is also the point. The walls have not gone unnoticed. Since 2014, the OECD's Common Reporting Standard has required participating jurisdictions to automatically share financial account information between tax authorities. As of 2024, Over 120 countries have committed to the framework, generating billions of data exchanges annually. The Cook Islands, notably, has a complex and evolving relationship with this standard, one that asset protection attorneys continue to monitor and root around in real time. In 2010, the United States passed FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which requires foreign financial institutions to report US account holders to the IRS or face a 30% withholding penalty on their US source income. The compliance cost of ignoring FATCA is, for most institutions, simply too high. The result is that US persons are now far more visible in offshore structures than they were 20 years ago. But visibility is not the same as vulnerability. Knowing that a trust exists and knowing who the settler is does not give a creditor or tax authority the ability to touch the assets inside it, particularly when those assets are held under Cook Islands law, managed by a local trustee, and protected by a flee clause pointing toward a jurisdiction with even less appetite for foreign enforcement. The global crackdown has been real, measurable, and genuinely impactful at the level of simple tax evasion. It has been far less effective against sophisticated, legally compliant asset protection structures. The architects of those structures have had 40 years to study every regulatory move, and they have spent those years building higher walls. Here is the final thing worth understanding, and it is the part that nobody who benefits from this system particularly wants discussed. The legal architecture described in this video is not illegal. It is not a crime to create a trust. It is not a crime to transfer assets to a trustee. The Cook Islands laws are legitimate sovereign legislation. The attorneys who draft these structures are licensed professionals operating within the explicit boundaries of the law, and that is precisely what makes this a story worth telling. Because the law, it turns out, is not a single unified system that applies equally to everyone who lives under it. It is a system with a public entrance and a private entrance. The public entrance is where most people spend their entire lives. Creditors can sue you, courts can garnish your wages, the IRS can levy your bank account, and a divorce court can divide your assets. The consequences of financial loss are real, and they are immediate. The private entrance leads somewhere else entirely. Behind it, the same laws that feel immovable from the public side become negotiable, architecturally re-engineered, and in many cases practically impenetrable. The Cook Islands did not create this inequality. It simply made it visible, exportable, and available at a price point that starts at roughly $50,000 for a basic structure and scales upward from there. The vault that the federal marshal walked away from was not empty because anything illegal happened. It was empty because someone at some point had the money to hire the right attorney. The paper holds, the fortress stands, and the two-tiered world keeps quietly expanding. And if this changed how you think about ownership, about law, about who the financial system was actually designed to serve, share it with one person who needs to see it, not for the algorithm. Because this kind of information only stays obscure for as long as people do not talk about it. The comment section is open. Tell me which part of this surprised you most. The flee clause, the contempt cell, the Subaru in Sioux Falls. I read everyone.